something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, good morning, and welcome, New Haven. Welcome, all of Connecticut, the world, New Orleans, Wisconsin, and every place there is out there. This is the Readman on 103.5 WNHH, New Haven, Connecticut, live, bringing you community radio at its best. And today I have a quality guest talking about a topic that I don't think the president or education reformers would like to hear about, but this is the truth to powwow. So, Dr. Barris, could you introduce yourself? And after she introduces herself, well, I'm just Jesse, and she's just she's just Kristen. That's it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jesse. So, again, like you said, my name is Kristen Buras. I was born and raised in the Deep South. I was born and raised in New Orleans, and that's a very critical part of my identity. Even after getting my PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the field of education, I wanted to come back to the Deep South to do my work. And so I worked with youth in New Orleans, and I actually taught in New York City in a public high school, and in Baltimore, got my PhD, and then spent 2 decades in higher education, first at Emory University in Atlanta, and then at GSU, Georgia State University. But I think really, honestly, the most important part about understanding my work isn't actually my work in higher education. It's the way I approach it. And so I'm not your traditional scholar or academic. I really identify as a scholar activist. And one of the things I did, we'll talk about later, is to establish a group called Urban South Grassroots Research Collective, which is a coalition with mostly African-American organizations in the city of New Orleans. And we've done work now for 2 decades around issues of racial inequity in public education. And we'll talk about that later, but that's sort of me in a nutshell. My words are my weapon. I write, and I'd love the opportunity to talk a bit more about how I approach my research, because again, it's very different from traditional academics. But that's me.
That's you. Well, all right. So let's think. So I wore a special tie today. So if we look at my tie over here, so I'm just a little former Jersey City boy, then an urban kid, and I wrote an essay in my first black teacher's classroom. She was Mrs. Stanfield, who was one of those teachers that left North Carolina to come up and help us ghetto boys up north become decent human beings. And I had written a story about Amazing Grace, and so Amazing Grace, I'm an Irish American kid, so we know all about the bagpipes, and the bagpipes, their warm up is Amazing Grace. And before Judy Collins did the song and it became really big, it was a very small song, maybe actually in southern churches, maybe at funerals.
Yes.
And the bagpipe is always used as a good piece to to do. But I had written a little essay, you get your high school stuff, and
Sure.
I think I was already bent on social justice in those days, and I was intrigued by the history of the song, because I didn't know that Reverend Newton was a slave ship captain and the whole stuff. But anyway, it's this thing that, and it's not to be religious on us, but the idea that you can redeem yourself over there. So Mrs. Stanfield, when I graduated and I was going to walk down and I was becoming a brand new teacher, oh my God, in 1980, 45 years ago, she showed up and she gave me my Amazing Grace tie. And
love that. And absolutely love that.
and research indicates, and I'm part of that. I'm one of those sort of the various, what do we call it? Statistics in the research that says if a black student has just one black teacher, they increase their chances of higher ed, of being successful in higher ed. And that's the same for white students as well. So I'm just one of those students. The research verifies that if you have at least one black teacher, and I'm bringing this up because I'm going to
Yeah,
switch it over to you.
of
At
course.
one time, New Orleans, before Katrina, had at least somewhere between 70 and 71% of its teaching force was black teachers. And I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about, what changed?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love the story that you tell because I mean, I think if we think about the African American history in the United States, you know, education has always been at the center of the freedom struggle, and Black teachers bring a certain set of political commitments and a vision to teaching that I think is very distinct and that, again, is informed by a very long civil rights struggle. Um, the story of New Orleans is something that um, is shocking in many ways. So New Orleans has a very robust history of the struggle for Black education. New Orleans has one of the earliest and largest free Black communities that was in the Treme area. Afro Creoles, were shoemakers and journalists and attorneys and doctors, and had a command of very many trades. And long before even the Civil War, they had started their own educational institutions. And so a lot of the push for educational equity and racial equity in New Orleans grows out of that long tradition. So you can imagine when Hurricane Katrina struck in 2005, the utter dismay that occurred when just months after the storm, about 20 years ago, it was announced that every single teacher in the city of New Orleans would be terminated. And that occurred without any due process whatsoever. So the majority of those teachers were African American. They were a very large portion of the city's Black middle class. And so that move to terminate all the teachers was a part of what became a much larger agenda around reconstituting the city's public school system. And in many ways, using the destructive effects of the hurricane to advance an educational agenda that they otherwise could not have implemented at the speed or at the scope that they did it in New Orleans because communities had been displaced, right? Bodies were still floating in the water. And so I'll pause there, but Black teachers being terminated was a very large part of that. And I don't know if you want me to say a little bit more about some of the other reforms that accompanied that, because what happened is that New Orleans, for many local, state, and federal leaders at the time, as well as many private philanthropists, was going to be sort of a stomping ground for a new experiment. And they wanted to change the public education sector in New Orleans in a way that could turn it into a model for other urban areas across the country. So what happened basically, I'll continue, is that when Katrina struck, they succumbed very quickly. Like I said, communities were still displaced. There's very little community input into the process. And what transpired is a new vision in which the public schools would be handed over to privatizers. And so when Katrina struck, one example would be that the federal government offered money to rebuild schools, but the federal monies that were being offered were not to reopen traditional public schools. They were to reopen schools as charter schools. And so the schools basically were taken over by a state level entity called the Recovery School District. That sort of entity was actually created about 2 years before Hurricane Katrina struck. But the apparatus was there, right? And so the state-run Recovery School District came in, took over the majority of public schools in New Orleans. And I should say this is really critical because, from the outside, you could say, well, this was all well and good. what are you saying? Are you saying that this was a racial project? That's exactly what I'm saying. So one illustration is that when Katrina struck, the state-run recovery school district could have only taken over a handful of the schools, because by the definition of failure at that time, most of the schools weren't failing. 2 months, 2 short months after Hurricane Katrina struck, the state legislature called a special session. And during that special session, they enacted a law called Act 35. And very straightforward, what it did is it moved upward the definition of failure. And by moving the definition of failure upward, at that point, the majority of schools were then failing. So it gave them cause to take over the schools. That cut point was just below the state average. They took over most of the schools away from the locally elected school board. So they're now going to be under the auspices of the state in Baton Rouge, 80, 90 miles outside of New Orleans. And over the course of 9 years, between 2005 and 2014, so just under a decade, they closed down, and I want listeners to understand that, closed down every neighborhood public school. They terminated every teacher in the city, and they reconstituted the entire system by handing over contracts to private operators to run charter schools, and brought in a large new teaching force that consisted of mostly, white, inexperienced recruits through organizations such as Teach for America. And I'll pause in a second, but again, I want to just sort of point out the questionable context of all of this. There was later a lawsuit around the termination of these teachers, and so many disturbing facts came out in the evidentiary record of that lawsuit. And one of the things that came out is that while African American teachers had not only lost their jobs, but you have to recall and understand that most of them had also lost their homes and their neighborhoods, right? Were largely decimated in the downtown area of the city, because Blacks had traditionally had access to the lower lying areas of the city. So it came to be known that many of these new recruits were paid stipends as high as $17,500 just to come to New Orleans and settle and take those teaching positions. And so, in a very targeted manner, the takeover was meant to take over an all-Black district and to turn it into the nation's premier experiment of privatization. And should anyone doubt what I'm saying, I'll provide just one more striking example of the discriminatory way that two different districts were treated. So very near New Orleans, there's another parish called St. Tammany, and it's a majority white parish and school district. And much like New Orleans, because it was in the same vicinity, it also suffered destruction or harm to at least 80% of its school buildings. Even though those two districts, the majority Black New Orleans and the majority white St. Tammany Parish, suffered the same damages from the hurricane, they received differential treatment. So within weeks of the hurricane striking, St. Tammany had most of its public schools back up and running, albeit not in the destroyed buildings at alternative locations, but those schools were back up and running in some capacity. And the teachers were not fired, and they were paid onward from Katrina on their salaries. Alternatively, in New Orleans, as I shared, the public schools remained closed. They were slowly reopened by the RIC and chartered out. All of the city's teachers were terminated, and not a single one of those teachers was paid a salary after the date of August 29th of 2005, when Katrina struck. So again, it's a striking example of the way two similarly situated districts received differential treatment in terms of reopening their public education system.
Sure, and it was an economic devastation to Black communities that they lost this middle class. Teachers are part of the middle class probably were homeowners, probably all those things,
Yes.
losing this economic impact at that time. And, it always struck me as when we remember all this, because this all happened on TV with Katrina. And
Yeah.
I remember Ani Duncan saying that Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to New Orleans. And my friends in New Orleans, I mean, cringing at that kind of concept. But I wanted to ask you this question because I'm sure
Sure.
my audience is wondering. So you're a Southerner, but you're a white Southerner.
Yes.
What led you to study Black education in New
That's
Orleans?
that's such an important question, and thanks for asking that. So, uh, like many white Southerners, I was not raised in the most progressive way. But through my own sort of education and community involvement, um, I have worked through a lot of my sort of racialized miseducation. I mean, if you want the longer version, it started when I was in college. At the time, Jonathan Kozol had written a book called Savage Inequalities, about the differential funding of majority sort of white suburban districts and majority of color urban districts. And I was very taken by those inequalities. Began to read like Malcolm X. I was a sociology major, a lot of literature in African American studies, and wound up volunteering at a summer program that was at a place located near an all Black housing development in the city of New Orleans. And I began sort of working under Black teachers in some of the local schools, getting to know families and the housing development. And those firsthand experiences really challenged a lot of the assumptions that I had about the way race operated in the city of New Orleans. And I came over many years um, uh, through community work and reading in African American studies, and all those things combined to really understand the dynamics of racism in a deeper way. And I really just wanted to be a part of fighting against that. I feel like it gives meaning to my life, because I've come to understand that all of our destinies are interconnected. Like one of my favorite quotes is from Martin Luther King, when he said that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And for me, that sort of defined my identity as a white anti-racist. I understand that that we're all interconnected, and that the well-being of Black people, and the kind of world that we live in, if there's an equity there, it's not the kind of world that I want to live in. The kind of world I want to live in is one in which we're all uplifted and we all have a chance to be our best selves. And so over time, I became involved with many African American grassroots organizations. And that's why I start off early saying that for me, the most critical component of my education, as much as I value my PhD at UW-Madison, which itself is a very progressive place and had great influence on me, the most important component of my education has been the friendships and mentorship of African American young people, community elders, activists that I've worked with in New Orleans, who have really helped to re-educate me, and to welcome me in to the circle of struggle. And so that's what my work has been about. And one of the main ways that I've pursued that is through this group that I told you about called Urban South Grassroots Research Collective.
Yes, could you tell us about that? I'm putting it in our chat box, the website, so they could look at
Sure.
that. But this we need to hear about this because this when I look at your work, we are going to talk about What We Stand to Lose, your latest book, but there's three other books before that.
Yeah.
So there's 20 years of this, and it's not just you. It's a community of education,
Yes.
a community of elders in there. So I think if you could tell us about the Urban South Grassroots, the Research Collaborative, and why you co-founded that, and who
Yeah.
did you
Yeah.
co-found it with? I'm
Yes.
sure it wasn't Ani Duncan.
No, no. So if you think of one of the first books that I wrote on New Orleans was actually a collaboration between myself, two veteran educators, one who was an educator and another one who was a poet, a Black poet, and their students. And they ran a program called Students at the Center. They would circle the chairs, and the kids would write and use digital photography and video making to tell the stories of the Black community, of their neighborhoods, of their schools. And so that book sort of exemplifies why I co-founded Urban Southwest Research Collective, because, traditional researchers basically, they get a research question, they go into a community, they gather what they call data from their subjects, right? They go home, they analyze it, they write things, and often they're never seen or heard from again, and they move on to their next book. I didn't want to be that kind of person, and I feel like that's an exploitive model, especially for me as a white scholar working in the area of African American education. And so I co-founded this group with an array of organizations. It included the Teachers Union, it included the Lower Ninth Ward School Development Group, which at the time was struggling to get schools even back into the neighborhood because there was no plan to even rebuild schools in that historic neighborhood. It included Students at the Center, the long-standing writing and literacy program that I mentioned. And it also included a number of cultural organizations like the Guardian Institute, which was run by a long-term Black veteran teacher who did a lot of work both in schools and out of schools around the Black artistic traditions in New Orleans. And there were other groups as well that were involved. And it's expanded over time to include other groups. But many of these groups were long-standing organizations that were doing work around racial and educational equity before Katrina even struck. And so the way that I work with these groups defines the way I do my research, because I don't just say, oh, I'm going to research this. My research agenda has grown out of the organic, ongoing conversations and interactions with these groups, whose members have really become like family to me. And throughout these conversations, very organically, we sort of hone in, okay, this is an issue that's important to the community, or this is a struggle that we anticipate, or a struggle that we're currently involved in. How can research help to illuminate the issue and feed into different grassroots organizing campaigns? And so that is sort of how my work has evolved over time. I don't gather data, I gather counter stories. I don't deal with subjects, I deal with people. I deal with New Orleans community members who have an important perspective on what's happened. And, the name Urban South Grassroots Research Collective, it was called that for a reason, right? A lot of these reforms were top down. They were honestly forced upon communities without their input or consent. Alternatively, the research that I do through USGRC is from the grassroots up. It is done in order to foreground a community perspective, a Black perspective on what is happening in the neighborhood. Because honestly, when we're talking about schools, those are supposed to be intimate spaces, and no perspective should be prioritized over that of the students and parents who are really should be owners of those institutions. And so that's how I've tried to approach my work.
So we know you're not alone. We know you're talking about a relevant thing, and some of my audience in Connecticut will wonder, well, why are we listening to New Orleans? And I will say because what's happened in New Orleans is happening all across this country, in every Black and brown community, in every poor urban school or rural school, because rural schools
Yeah.
are also can be poor and can be racially isolated. But in all these schools, when I look at the data, what do I find? So when they not only did they when they closed the New Orleans schools, did we lose Black teachers? But I would argue when I look at the data, we lost certified librarians, we lost certified literacy,
Absolutely.
we lost certified counselors, we lost certified math teachers, art teachers, music teachers, and in New Orleans, I mean, we'll shift over to your latest book because you say what we stand to lose. And when I look at New Orleans, it's a city bigger than a city. It's as big as New York City, maybe bigger.
Yeah.
Musically, it has inspired not only every city in America, but every city in the world. So if you could bring us to that component. I know my Connecticut people need to understand, just like New York and Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Maybe we might change the narrative that these education reforms have been a war on black and brown public community schools and teachers. Maybe we can do that. But bringing it back to that because now I've taken you off. But I want to move to what we stand to lose, because you said you use stories and data. I see the stories as data, because the data
Yeah.
lives, it breathes, it walks, it talks.
Sure.
But in what we stand to lose, could you tell us what do we stand to lose if we go with this education reform narrative that robs us of our black teachers, robs us of our librarians, our music teachers, our art teachers? What do we stand to lose? And why one school in New Orleans? I know
Yeah.
it's a lot,
That's
but
such a
there,
good question. I'll back up just for one moment because you also asked why New Orleans is important to the nation, right? So let me just say something about that very briefly. So, there's a justified frustration with public schools. Public schools have been systematically underfunded, and that has to do with the broader structure of inequity in our country. So when parents are worried about their local schools, they're not crazy, right? But the problem is that when you have a problem, you want to understand its cause, because the solution should be linked to the cause, right? The problem is that this model that's been advanced is that reformers will go into communities and politicians will go into communities and say, oh, the schools are not doing the best job they could. And so we need to remake these schools, let's privatize them. And it's like, well, actually, so many times the public school struggles are generated by the fact there's been racially targeted disinvestment by local and state and federal officials in Black and brown communities. So if you would just fund the schools better, then they can do their magic, right? Instead, they put on offer this ahistorical narrative that the schools are failing. They don't want to talk about racism as a major reason for that.
no,
Instead, they just have this very simplistic narrative. The schools are failing. Let's remake them as charters. Let's bring in new teachers, right? And so they scapegoat the existing teachers, demonize the public schools, shutter them. And I'll have you know that over the past 2 decades, 25,000 public schools have been shuttered. And so New Orleans is not alone in that. That's a national thing in urban centers across the country. And so I wrote the book, What We Stand to Lose: Black Teachers, the Culture They Created, and the Closure of a New Orleans High School, in order to help us push back against this narrative that has demonized teachers and the schools that they built, teachers of color specifically. And so, yes, the book is about one school, but in many ways, it's the story of so many schools across the country. The school I focused on grew out of, again, one of the members of USGRC, Reverend Willie Calhoun, who was he's a preacher and a leader in the lower ninth ward of New Orleans, and was a part of a broader coalition that struggled to get schools back in the neighborhood. He is a graduate of a historic school that was closed, called George Washington Carver Senior High School. It was opened in 1958 and was decimated in 2005. So for almost 50 years, it functioned. It was a school led by Black educators. And so I heard Reverend Calhoun and some of his fellow alumni talk very positively about Carver Senior High School. And similarly, other members of the coalition talked, in similar ways about the Black teachers they had at some of the other high schools in New Orleans. And together we said, something's going on here, because the dominant top-down narrative is that these schools were failures that needed to be replaced. And yet the experiences of community members with their Black teachers were something very different. And so we thought that a case study of a school would be really powerful. And so I did oral histories with veteran teachers from Carver Senior High School, as well as interviewing students or alumni from that school over the school's 50 years history. And what makes Carver an interesting choice is Carver had a particularly bad reputation from the outside. It was located near an area called the Desire Housing Development. When it was built in 1958, it was built way on the outskirts of New Orleans, where land was very cheap. It was built on a swamp. There was no water, no electricity at the time. It was built near a public dump. And so it wasn't really intended necessarily to uplift the Black community, but it was built to satiate some of the demands for desegregation by building this large complex that African Americans had not seen before. And so this large complex was built. When teachers got to school, there were like no desks or anything. They built that school, right? And so over 50 years, I collected these oral histories where students talked about the ways that teachers uplifted them and educated them. Just a few examples would be like, Mr. Clarence Righteous, right, who taught horticulture at the school because it had sort of it prepared kids for college, but it also had the trades. And he referred to the students as his grandchildren because he said, I would educate one set of kids, and years later they'd have children and they'd come to the school, and then I was teaching their children, so they were my grandchildren, and he knew them by name. And said, "Oh, are you a such and such?" Their last name. Oh yeah, I am Mr. Righteous. And so it mattered to him. These were his children and grandchildren, right? There was a well-known teacher, Mr. Vaughn Bush, who had taught generations of jazz musicians across the city. And she actually schooled a man named Herlin Riley, who many folks into jazz will know because he's considered one of the top drummers in the world. He was still visiting Mrs. Vaughn Bush at her home when she was in her 80s. He and some friends, some band members went to her house and serenaded her with a trumpet. And the book has a picture of them on that day when she was in her mid 80s. Miss Vaughn Bush is holding that trumpet and she's surrounded by some of her band students. This is the rich, long, intergenerational culture that was built at Carver. And these are the things that were threatened by the state takeover and the mass chartering. And, should anyone be a naysayer, I will give you a striking example to the story I just shared. So think about Mr. Vaughn Bush, this dedicated musician. She played numerous instruments with immense command, beloved by her students, upheld those longstanding traditions of music in New Orleans. So a parallel is the following. There was a high school that was closed. It was called Frederick Douglass High School. It was closed. It was taken over by a well-known charter network called the Knowledge is Power Program, KIPP. I won't name this individual, but there was a well-known musician, Black musician in New Orleans, who lives in that neighborhood. This musician, when that charter operator took over, conveyed to me that there was a day on which she saw them take some of the musical sheet music and instruments out of that building and throw them into a dumpster. This is the regard that primarily outsiders running these charter schools have had for the culture and knowledge of the city's Black community. Utterly destructive. And so hence the name of the book, What We Stand to Lose, just trying to show the cultural value of the traditions that Black teachers upheld and built for the city's youth. And by comparison, to show the ways those traditions have been undermined and at times destroyed by this movement to privatize school.
So when I can picture this now. It's I have some friends,
Yeah.
70 years old, so I have some friends from down south who grew up in segregated schools and Black segregated schools. And sometimes we'll have conversations like educators always say, oh, we needed Brown versus the Board of Topeka and all that. And somehow we the conversation, especially around white educators like myself, oh, was so glad what happened. And my colleagues, one of my colleagues from the Panhandle in Florida who went to a Black segregated school, a good friend of mine, she said, Jesse, you don't understand. That was not a failing school. That was a school that made me who I am. I had Black teachers. I had a history. I had a culture. Everyone in that school valued who I am and who we are as a people. So this idea that teachers carry culture and
Yeah.
value and this education reform, because I think we're starting to see the counter narrative that's forming here. The dominant narrative is these schools are failing and we need to close them down and we're going to save all you black children or
Yes.
all the children of New Orleans. And no one's saying, meanwhile, we're going to make $1 million over there. They're not saying that. But we should just look at the stocks of these people and the bank accounts. But this loss, and when you were talking about they were throwing away the music seats of great musical educators and leaders in the community, and we can't get that back. And where does that dumpster go? And now you took those people out of the school. So I'm getting that piece. So I want to see what is the counter narrative. So we know the dominant narrative, and we know that PDK, Phi Delta Kappa, does a poll every year.
Yeah.
Every year it says most Americans believe our public schools are failing, but when you look closer, they say, but people believe their local schools are okay. And that kind of is being fed from what you
Right.
were saying about George Washington Carver. And they use that against us. They use that against us. They didn't use the one that said most people feel that their local schools are successful. They wanted the big one. And that's the, but if we're going to form a counter narrative, and not only for New Orleans, but in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in New York, in LA, in the Southwest, in all 50 states. What would that counter narrative be? What would an anti-racist public school system look like that didn't close 20? I think you said 25,000 community schools were closed. And
Yeah.
when you close a community school in an urban area, it is an oasis of safety, of economic. The housing prices around there are higher. There's usually a playground. You can play basketball. You can play all these things. When you close those schools, you almost kill a community. So give me the counter narrative that the Urban South Grassroots Research Collaborative would advocate for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me build on something you said quickly first, which is this idea of schools being centerpieces, right? So just taking the city's lower ninth ward as an example, when all the schools were destroyed, FEMA came in as a federal agency and assessed the damages. Rather than saying, oh, well, this is the damages to this lower ninth ward school and this is the damages to this one, they didn't reallocate the money necessarily to those schools. They put all of the money in a general fund. And instead of master planners decided where those schools would be. Well, early on, that plan did not include rebuilding schools in the lower ninth ward. There was an immense struggle just to get the elementary school back by the community. They had to charter it because that's the only way it could reopen. But it was the community wanting to recharter a pre-existing school so they could continue running it. It took then another decade for Reverend Calhoun and his coalition to actually get the master planners to commit to and rebuild a high school in the lower ninth ward. And Reverend Calhoun would say often, and he was right, is, you can't have a neighborhood without a school. So the fact that they didn't want a school back meant they didn't want anyone in the neighborhood back, because no homeowner wants to come back and reinvest in a house that was destroyed in a vulnerable area when there's no place to send their child to school. And so these community institutions are bedrock of neighborhoods. You're perfectly right on that. Alternatively, you mentioned the money, right? So just one quick story is that, one very interesting thing that happened with the charter school movement in New Orleans is that many of these charter schools, Jesse, while they have not spent a lot of money at the classroom or school resource level, we have seen a great expansion in the administrative bureaucracy of these schools, where they have all these administrators and people by all kinds of fancy names who are getting paid a ton. Some of the administrative salaries have greatly expanded since the pre-Kurchini years. So there was one horrendous example where a charter school freshman principal was being paid something like $130,000 for a ninth grade class that consisted of a handful of kids. It's that kind of thing. Now, that's one of the more extreme examples, but again, it's been a very big money-making experiment because there's all kinds of subcontracts as well, because they're independently operated schools. They control contracts for back office accounting, busing, food, school technology. And so it just opens up this whole way in which they can control the budget and hand out contracts in ways that benefit they and their friends, right? Unlike within, the community school, Martin Luther King and the Lower Ninth Ward, which was the desire to uplift the community. So it's very different models of education. I think the counter story is in many ways an iteration of the story that is told in What We Stand to Lose. It's the story of, from the outside, it seems like this school is a failure, right? So, for example, in the book, I quote a news article that was put out in the local paper in the 1980s about the desired housing development. And there's this image in this news article with there's a Black man crying. There's a huge rat in the foreground of the picture. There's a drug needle. This is a depiction of the community that Carver is situated in. And the article one of the lines in the article is that the residents don't know what a real neighborhood is and don't know what success means. That's the outside narrative in a nutshell, right? This is why we need to close the schools. But from the inside, when I interviewed students, they said things like this. Like there was a graduate from the 1980s who said, Carver sort of had a reputation as being in a bad area. But that's not what it was like. I felt like my teachers always invested in me and cared about me. Another graduate called Carver a buried treasure. So again, the view from the inside is very different than the view from the outside. And the book just contains such compelling stories about the things that teachers did. One of the students, Mary Polk, spoke so highly of her choir teacher, who had kids of her own, but still invested an immense amount of time at Carver educating her students. And on her graduation day, her teacher, Miss Francis, presented her with a scholarship. This teacher had applied for a university scholarship for her student. The student wasn't even aware she had done this. She had done all the work back to provide the paperwork and things that were required. Student would receive a scholarship, and she gifted this to her on her graduation from Carver. I mentioned Mr. Righteous, the horticulture teacher. Some of the foods that they grow in the garden, he would send back to kids who lived in the desired housing development, because it was a very low income area and there was a food shortage. When you're poor, it's not always easy to pay all of your bills. And so some of the foods that were grown, not only did he teach kids about science, right? Not only did he teach them the things they read, literacy, right? But in a very pragmatic way, the foods that were grown as a part of that program were sent home with children to feed their families. These are the kinds of things that teachers did on a daily basis. I love this story. Miss Lenora Condell Gray was a dynamic social studies teacher. One of the students I spoke to said that Miss Condell is one of the reasons that she registered to vote. Yeah, I love that story. But Miss Condell also, she was a go-getter. Not only did she help with her cousin, Carol Righteous, plan some of the senior events, they planned a senior prom for the parents. The parents came in, with their ties and dresses, and had a celebratory night for the parents, right, to bring them into the school community. And so through these kinds of traditions, they built a place that meant something to students. The charter schools don't have that kind of meaning to our young people. I have activists that I work with in New Orleans who have talked about the way that they talk to the kids when they get off the buses, and the kids look clinically depressed. The thing that I don't cover as much is sort of in the concluding chapter of the book, Jesse. I do talk about the closure of the school and how that debacle unfolded. And I get into it a little bit, but I actually talked to some of the kids attending the charter school that replaced the historic school that was closed, and to compare their testimony about their experiences in that charter school. with its oral histories of the students that were in the historic school is so striking. There was a student who said, look, I went to this charter school, but it is located in the same place where the historic school was. And I had heard my mom talk about Carver, and my grandmother talk about Carver because they went to Carver, and I wanted to be part of that tradition. But when I went to that school, a school that actually took Carver's name, but was not part of that legacy, it was just a charter school with the same name. He said, it didn't take but a week for me to see that something very different was going on. You know, if you didn't raise your hands in a certain way, if you didn't sit in a certain position, and follow all these sort of no excuses rules in this very disciplinary culture, they pull you out in the hall, and if you didn't listen, you were out of there. You know, and he sort of ended our interview by saying it seemed like they were more about disciplining than educating. Seemed like it was more about punishment than about uplifting the students. You know, and so again, what do we stand to lose? We stand to lose an uplifting culture to one that really is more about profiteering than uplifting. And the contrast could not be more stark.
So we've got this up. I'm gonna uh, ask a question that maybe I'm
Yeah,
playing a little bit of the devil's advocate here, but
sure.
surely after all this money and all these reforms and all this new district and firing of all the bad teachers, surely the schools test scores are rocketed high, and now New Orleans, those charter school systems are rocking the state of Louisiana. Is that accurate?
I'm so glad you asked that. First of all, you don't have to believe Kristen Buras. The state itself, the state of Louisiana, gives letter grades to schools based on their performance. By the state's letter grade, 20 years later, still nearly half of the schools are rated C, D, or F. That's by the state's own standards. And by the way, the standards by which they judge the charter schools are now actually lower than the standards used to judge the traditional schools. They lifted the standard up to take over the school, but after they began to try them out, they ratcheted the standard down. There have been a lot of games, not gains, around charter school performance. I mean, the state's metric has continuously been altered to the benefit of charter schools. I like to say that charter school success has been legislatively contrived, and other kinds of things. There was a report recently issued by an institute called the Education Research Alliance at Tulane University. They put out a 20-year report applauding these alleged gains made in the city's charter school. But if you look, the reality is this: Louisiana as a whole has some of the lowest performing school districts in the nation. Now, 20 years later, after the chartering of the city, New Orleans is still one of the lowest performing districts in the nation by test scores. And so the gains are a facade.
They're the curtain in the wizard.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
they're covering the wizard.
Right. The story is much more complicated. And the crazy thing is that there's been a number of scandals that have come to the fore with some of these charter schools. And again, not just accusations, but in many cases, things that have been established as fact. And the state writing a report saying the charter school violated this or that. There was one charter school network that basically allowed students to take the test for one another, to take the test multiple times, and so forth. And this was, later discovered that this occurred. And so you can only wonder, with the lack of accountability, are these kinds of things happening in the other schools? I do not invest very much confidence in the data that comes out of the charter school sector in New Orleans, nor do I invest confidence in some of the number crunchers who are crunching that data and saying that the system is a success. The Education Research Alliance at Tulane actually receives some of its funding from the same pro-charter school foundations that have bankrolled charter schools in New Orleans and in other places in this country. So if you're getting your money from the same foundation that bankroll charters, you know, for me, I think that your results, you know, your findings are going to be compromised. And there isn't time here, but I do have a report coming out through the Network for Public Education that pushes back against that 20-year report that applauded New Orleans public schools and these alleged gains. So if anyone's interested, be looking out for it. The name of that report is The Stories Behind the Statistics. You know, because it's far more complicated than just saying, look at the scores. Those in many ways have been contrived by ignoring certain data sets or framing the issues in particular kinds of ways. You know, I'll stop there because I could go on, but you know, again, by the state's own standards, these schools, the majority of them, or close to the majority of them, remain C, D, or F. And you know, that's not a choice. You know, so here's another thing, the A-rated charter schools in New Orleans are majority white, and it's a small handful of schools, and most of them have selective admissions criteria. And some of them were among the few schools that were not taken over by the state-run RSD, but remained under the auspices of the local district because they were already high performing. And so you see that sort of racial segregation within even the charter system and who attends where.
So now we come down. Now I'm beginning to understand a lot more about New Orleans and the smoke and mirrors education
Yeah.
reform that costs hundreds of billions of dollars over there. But now we're this radio station is in New Haven. In Connecticut, we have New Haven, we have Bridgeport, we have Hartford, we have Waterbury, a number of urban school districts with majority of Black and brown students in their schools. And why should they care about this? That I say they're suffering the same kinds of issues, but why would you think? Why should other cities
Yeah.
listening and understanding, and what does it have to do with them? Maybe this is just New Orleans and I don't live in New Orleans and I do like gumbo, but I can get it there. I can go on a nice, weekend flight and go down to the French Quarter, listen to a little music and stuff and get a little crayfish, maybe, but I can leave. But so why should the rest of America and particularly our urban school districts care about this?
That's such an important question. I mean, I think my response would be that to understand that this is not random, and nor is it singular. So I'll just give one illustration. There's an organization that was recently developed called the City Fund. Interestingly, the City Fund, one of its early leaders, was actually the former CEO of a group called New Schools for New Orleans, which incubated charter schools. So it started up a lot of the charter schools. It got federal monies, it got private monies to charter up the schools. So this group called the City Fund basically has $200+ million, and is bankrolled, by the way, by one of the same foundations that bankrolls the Education Research Alliance, which is producing this objective research, right, on the charter schools. Anyhow, the City Fund basically has a strategy. And they have target cities, and they, over the next decade, want to critically reconstitute the education sector, to use their language, of those cities, so that that sector is more heavily populated by charter schools rather than traditional public schools. And so I guess the point I'm making is that, what happened to New Orleans is not random. What happened in New Orleans is coming to a neighborhood near you. It is a model that has been exported to other cities. Many, many reports have been put out by think tanks that advocate these market-based education reforms about how to take the New Orleans model and expand it to, Chicago, Detroit, New York City, areas outside of Boston, Oakland, LA. The list goes on and on. Memphis, Nashville, Houston. I'm in touch with activists in Houston right now. They've been fighting a takeover for 2 years. I just got an email from an activist in Miami. He's concerned about uh, the New Orleans model coming there. I get contacted by parents, students, activists in cities across this country who are concerned that the New Orleans model is coming down the pike to them. There are millions of dollars behind implementing this model because privatization turns schools into profit-making institutions for a subset of people. Very often that subset is white. Of course, there are black allies that are part of this, but in no way do they represent the grassroots communities that are subjected to these reforms. But New Haven should not be under the illusion that they're not vulnerable. Anywhere that there's a public school that's underfunded, you're vulnerable because the narrative can easily be laid on top of that school that it's failing, and then hence the takeover begins.
All right. Thank you. It's come to our time. I want to thank you and everyone
Thank you,
for
Jesse.
listening. You're welcome. And I'd just like to say that Christian is the person that's showing tireless the work of Black teachers in historic New Orleans, but also giving us a warning of what's coming down to everyone. I want to say thank you. I think we're going to hear the music, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, so much for your time, to all of your listeners.
Thank you.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong.